Okay. We're synchronized with YouTube. Let's see if we're synchronized with Facebook. Okay, we're all ready. Ladies and gentlemen, my guest this evening, tonight, it's probably not evening, it's not night in the States, if I'm not wrong. It's around 2 p.m. in United States. Jared Taylor, my guest for the third time, this time a part of a live stream where we will comment on presidential debate in the United States of America between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And then we will try to comment or philosophize a little bit about the difference between both visions of Trump presidency and Biden presidency, and how Jared Taylor thinks the presidency of hypothetical presidency of Biden Harris would look like. Jared Taylor, thank you. It's an honor as always. Thanks for accepting my invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure to join you. Thank you for inviting me.
It's pleasure, as I already said. Mr. Taylor, did you watch the presidential debate, the first presidential debate between Trump and Biden? How did it look like to you?
Yes, I watched it straight to finish. I watched every minute of it. And I must say, as an American, it was rather an embarrassment to see such a disorganized, sloppy, unmannerly contest between two people who are proposing to be president of the United States. I am, well, what should I say? I'm perhaps old fashioned in this respect, but I think people should follow the rules. And if there's supposed to be 2 minutes of uninterrupted comment by your opponent, you should stay silent for 2 minutes. And the number of times Donald Trump interrupted, but this is just an aspect of format. And we have all known that Donald Trump is a fellow who has a difficult time being quiet while other people speak. And we all know that he is not very much of a gentleman. So I suppose that should not have been a surprise. But even among his supporters, it was pretty clear to me that his behavior was not something that people found impressive. So just to start off on the way that the debate was held, and I'm sure all around the world, people were even more surprised than Americans were, because compared to Asians, for example, I have friends in Japan. My Japanese friends were absolutely astonished to see two people engaged in such rude and unmannerly, disorganized, and oftentimes insulting conversation. I'm sure Europeans, I'm sure practically all around the world, the sentiment was the same, that this was a very undignified brawl between people who want to be the president of the most powerful country in the world.
You pointed out the lack of manners from Donald Trump, but we're quite used to that. But Joe Biden was also not a gentleman. He said at one point in the debate to Donald Trump, "Just shut up," or something like that.
Yes.
Was that a surprise to you?
No, it was not a surprise. And the reason he behaved that way is that I'm sure he was afraid that he would be criticized if he did not react in a similar way. People would think that he was being pushed around by this bully. And in the United States, the theory is that you must always stand up to a bully, that you fight back. You give him a punch in the nose, and that will send him away screaming. So that's why I'm sure Joe Biden behaved the way he did. And I must say, I didn't do the counting, but it was clear that Donald Trump interrupted Joe Biden more frequently than happened the other way around. So Biden was more or less provoked into this. It perhaps would have been better if he had maintained a gentlemanly demeanor, but I think at the same time he was afraid he would be called a sissy and a coward if he didn't fight back, at least to some degree.
Is this format of debate an outdated thing? Was I don't know the history of presidential debates in America quite well, but you most certainly do. Was it anything better in the past in the history? Could an average voter in America get more information uh, from such debates than obviously nowadays?
Generally, I think voters get an impression of the personality of the candidate more than they get information. There was a time back in 1960. 1960, I believe, was the first presidential debate. It was a debate between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy came across as more relaxed, more personable, more likable. And it's often said that Richard Nixon needed a shave. So he had this sort of dark shadow under his chin. And all of these things played in favor of John F. Kennedy rather than Richard Nixon. But rather than looking for information, because we can get information if we want it. And even back in the 1960s, although it was more difficult to get information than it is today, those who want information can find it. When people see a debate, they want to get an impression of the personality of the candidate. How does the candidate react when he is attacked in some way? Is a candidate witty? Does a candidate smile? Does the candidate behave himself? Is he rude? Is he generous to his opponent? All of these things, I think, ultimately are more important in the voter's mind than the information that is received. And in this case, the notion that we got of the personality and of the nature of the way to carry on a debate from both candidates was negative. But I would say that it was more negative for Donald Trump than from Joe Biden. I know that many supporters of Donald Trump were hoping that this would be an opportunity for him to crush Joe Biden, and that he needed to crush Joe Biden because he's trailing so badly in the polls. Another theory was that Joe Biden is beginning to become senile. He's slowly losing his mind. And Trump supporters were hoping that it would become very evident to the viewers that after 1 hour and a half of debate, and that's a long time, they're on their feet, they are under the spotlights, they're having to think that after an hour and a half of this, Joe Biden would become clearly disoriented and start making incoherent answers. And I think to an extent he did. He did get tired. And there were times when Donald Trump would have been much better off just letting Joe Biden wander around and end up giving some kind of not very relevant and sometimes confusing answers. But Trump can't resist stepping in and trying to poke his opponent and make him stumble. I think he lost an opportunity. Now, it seemed clear to me that Donald Trump did not get tired in the same way Joe Biden did. But if this was supposed to be a demonstration of Joe Biden's senility, it did not succeed. Joe Biden may be getting old. His mind is probably not as quick as it was when he was younger. You could say the same thing about me, but he's clearly not senile. So that would have been a big disappointment to the supporters of Donald Trump.
What did you think about the host, the administrator of the debate, the journalist from the Fox TV?
Well, this Wallace guy, many people who support Donald Trump thought that he was unfair. I thought that he was about as fair as you could expect under the circumstances. He asked Joe Biden some difficult questions. He asked Donald Trump difficult questions. And I don't think that Trump gained any friends when he said, well, as expected, I'm not debating only Joe Biden. I see I have to debate you too. I thought that was unfair. it seemed to me that the moderator was trying to make sure that both sides followed the rules. It was a much more difficult exercise to try to get Donald Trump to follow the rules. And I believe that he was asking difficult questions of both men. So most people have a sense that if they want their guy to win, then they're going to say that the moderator was unfair to that guy. I thought that he was reasonably fair.
What do you say about the argument that, okay, many conservatives were against Donald Trump in 2015 from exactly the same reasons as you critiqued him. He's not cordial. He's not gentleman. He likes to interrupt. He likes to be rude towards his debating opponents. But in 3 or 4 years of his presidency, it seems that most of conservatives have come to believe that Trump's behavior is something they needed, because if there wasn't for Trump, there were only conservatives left. For example, like Senator Cruz or Jeb Bush and similar conservatives. What do you think about this argument? Is there any third way or path?
To me, there are several aspects here. One is Donald Trump's nature as a human being. He's rude, he's a braggart. I think he's quite superficial. He is offensive in many ways. And then there's the question of his policies. These are two different things. I don't consider Donald Trump to be a gentleman or a statesman, but I far prefer his policies over those that Joe Biden is going to try to enforce. So those are different matters. The other is the extent to which Donald Trump has tried to carry out his campaign promises. And one can be opposed to Donald Trump on any number of different grounds. Those who supported him because he was going to build a wall on the southern border with Mexico, he was going to deport all illegal immigrants, he was going to end the amnesty for children who had been brought illegally into the United States. He was going to end birthright citizenship so that people who were born of illegal aliens born in the United States, they would not become citizens. He promised all of these things. He did very, very little in that respect. And so you can be disappointed with him for that reason. But if that is the reason that you're disappointed with Donald Trump, voting for Joe Biden isn't going to help, because Joe Biden is going to do everything completely in the opposite direction from all of that. So there is, I think, a legitimate critique of Donald Trump that he did not try to carry out the populist, nationalist platform that he ran on. And so you can be resentful of that. The fact that once he was in office, he behaved by and large in terms of policy like an ordinary Republican, trying to stop the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, also getting a tax cut for corporations. All of those things, that is standard Republican stuff. He also did such things as cutting regulations. Industry likes that sort of thing. These are all standard Republican policies, and yet he was elected by not only primary voters who are tired of traditional Republican politics, but he was elected by an electorate, a general electorate that is tired of standard Republican politics. So it is a fair argument to say that in some respects he was captured by the Republicans. So if you were a never Trumper, if you are a Republican who thought, no, this guy's no good for us because he's not a Republican, you should in some respects be comforted, because when he was in office, he did behave more like a Republican than many of his voters expected him to.
Well, you mentioned nationalism. populism. Trump's definition or the meaning of the word nationalism and populism obviously presupposes the so-called civic nationalism. He has a vision of American nation that is a composite of um, many races, many ethnicities, many religions. He basically doesn't care about problems of whites, blacks as blacks, and so forth. He just cares about hypothetical, abstract American nation. I'm not sure if if it exists. You'd probably please correct me if I'm strawmanning you. You'd probably say that there is no such thing as multi-ethnic or multiracial and so forth American nation. But nevertheless, his vision uh, of American nationalism presupposes civic nationalism. On the other hand, Democrats nowadays, modern Democrats, seem to have this vision of America as just being a center of globalism. For them, there is no nation whatsoever. There are just some ethnicities, some races. People come, people go. Everyone should be able to come and go, and so forth. But for example, call yourself a white advocate, if I'm not wrong. This is
Yes.
the most relevant, credible description of what you would describe yourself, if I'm not wrong. What would be your critique of both of them, both of Democrats' vision of America and this Trump's vision of America?
Well, let's start with the Democrats. The Democrats do have some notion of what it means to be an American, but it is strictly a set of ideas. And if you adhere to a set of ideas which are not very substantial, but they have to do with loving diversity or being tolerant, being basically liberal, leftist, that is all it takes to be an American. If you think that anyone can become American so long as he adopts certain liberal leftist ideas, then that makes you an American. But by that standard, you don't even have to live in the United States. You can be living in a grass hut in Uganda. And if you think the right ideas, then that makes you an American. Hillary Clinton was very clear about that in one of the lectures that she gave to a Brazilian bank, I believe it was. She says, being an American is just a set of ideas. So you living where you are, you could be an American. All you need to do is think a few of the right things. This is, of course, lunacy. No country works that way. You might say that a political party could conceivably work that way, that you subscribe to certain ideas and you're in. But a nation has to have something much more than that. And especially it has to be much more than thinking that to be an American, all it is, you want to be a leftist, you in favor of diversity. In effect, you're saying to be an American means that you believe there's almost no definition of being an American other than you think everyone can be an American. It's almost as simple as that. No nation can operate that way. Now, what about Donald Trump's sense of civic nationalism? It is true that he would say not everyone in the world is potentially an American. And he would not say that all you have to do is think a few things to be American. He has some sort of dim notion that some people are more likely to be better Americans than others. He has a vague, intuitive sense that Muslims, for example, are not the most likely candidates to become good Americans. I think you would have a hard time explaining why. He also has the idea that if you come to the United States illegally, if you break the law to come here, you are not a good potential American. Whereas, of course, for the Democrats, it makes no difference if you broke the law to come here. Once you become a progressive and start voting for Democrats, then you're just as good an American as someone who's been here for 10 generations. So Donald Trump has some hazy notion that some people are better Americans than others, and some people are less likely to become good Americans. But I don't think he has ever thought about this question in a systematic and well-ordered way. If you were to ask him point blank, are white people more likely to become better Americans than non-white people? I don't know what he would say, but I think if he were in public, he would certainly say, oh, no, not at all. People of any race can become Americans. Although in private, he might think that, well, maybe there is something to this, that once the white majority has disappeared, the United States will change in dramatic ways. But he has never, ever said that. To me, there are really two criteria for thinking sensibly in terms of race. And I have never heard of Donald Trump thinking in terms that would justify that he thinks has sensible views. And one is to recognize racial differences in intelligence, for example, or racial differences in propensities. I think that he would publicly deny, and maybe even privately deny, that there are differences in average IQ between Blacks, Asians, Hispanics, whites, etc. He would deny this. Also, I think he would also deny the idea that whites as a group have legitimate group interests. He has never said anything in public to lead me to believe that he thinks in those terms. Again, what he thinks in private, I have no idea. But it almost makes no difference what he thinks in private, because his job is to articulate a certain vision of the United States to the public. Now, when he was elected, I thought it was not impossible that he would be the sort of person who, when he was engaged in a sort of offhanded conversation with reporters, he might say, well, what's wrong with white people wanting to remain a majority in the United States? Because it's an excellent question. Why is that wrong? And liberals are never asked to explain why it's wrong for whites to want to be a majority, just as Jews want to be a majority in Israel, just as the Japanese want to be a majority in Japan, the Turks want to be a majority in Turkey. That's perfectly natural. Why is it wrong for the descendants of the people who built the United States to want to remain the majority population? Well, he's never asked that question. I also thought it might not be impossible if he were to say, well, the reason why there are so few Black astrophysicists, or there are so few Black top lawyers in the United States, is because on average, they're just not as smart as white people. He's never, ever said anything like that. And so to me, the fact that he has ignored both questions, the question of racial differences and the question of the legitimate group interests of whites, that says to me that he does not have a real understanding either of race in the abstract, nor does he think in terms of the demographic interests of white people as the legitimate majority of the United States. So again, to repeat, he is different from the Democrats in that he has some vague, stumbling sense that certain people, Muslims, for example, or people from what he called shithole countries, allegedly, that they might not be the best Americans. But none of this appears to me to be systematically thought out. And so I think that if you were to propose to him, okay, immigration to the United States should be based on education, an ability to speak English, a profession, all of these things, I think he might say that's a better system than what we have now, but he would never, ever suggest that race should be a part of that. So in that sense, it's correct for you to use the term civic nationalism, although his notion of civic nationalism, again, is more instinctive and somewhat rough and hazy and not very well thought out.
I remember when I was a child in the 80s and in the 90s, we thought of America in two ways. Of course, America is a symbol of capitalism, probably because of the Cold War. Uh, but America was also a symbol of nationalism for us. Of course, civic nationalism, because we from Slovenia, we would always say we don't have a strong national identity. We're too weak about that. Look at the Americans, all their flags and their national pride and so forth. And if I think about this, it really is a bit strange, isn't it? When did it begin in America uh, with um, with this silly, crazy notion of either being a center of the world or being a nation of everybody who comes there legally? When did it stop being a normal country?
I would say certainly by the time the Second World War was over, the United States was obviously so much more powerful than any other nation on earth. At that point, Americans began to think that, well, we really are. We are the most important country. We're the center of the universe, and everyone should be like us. I think you could probably trace it back further than that. At the end of the First World War, for example, there was some sense that we were awfully important, but, and this is something very important, even though Woodrow Wilson had been a key factor in establishing the League of Nations, the United States did not join. We did not want to be part of that. There was still a sense of isolation in the United States. We reluctantly got into that war. Remember, the United States didn't enter into this war that went from 1914 to 1918 until 1917. We were there at the very tag end because Americans didn't want to get involved. And once it was over, Americans didn't want to get involved in the League of Nations and all these trustees for former German colonies. No, we weren't involved. But certainly by the time the Second World War was over, many Americans started thinking, well, yes, we really are the most important country, the most valuable country, and our ideas should rule the world. Or certainly our ideas are the best, and other countries should be more like us. Now, this has not entirely disappeared, but at the same time, more Americans are recognizing that our ideas don't even necessarily work here in the United States. We're supposed to be this great democracy, and yet we have this cuckoo system of an electoral college. No one is ever going to want to imitate that. It's very strange. You can become president of the United States even if you win fewer votes than your opponent. We also have a two-party system in which there are only two choices at the ballot box. European countries have many choices. Often, sometimes, some people would say too many. But in the United States, we have one party, another party, occasionally a third party will crop up, but most of the time, we just get two choices and they're really rather limited. At the same time, many countries around the world see what is happening here in the United States, and they don't say, oh, we want to be like that. No, we have a kind of divisiveness here. They see the racial problems we have. They see all of the extremely so-called progressive movements about transvestites, transsexuals, homosexuals, all of this very, very liberal business. And then we become adamant that everyone else be like us. Take homosexuals, for example. Up until maybe 15 or 20 years ago, in most states, homosexual activity was illegal in the United States. Those laws were not very often enforced, but it was illegal. And now we are going all around the world preaching to people about how homosexuals should be able to marry each other. We have this idea that, okay, maybe we were wrong 15 years ago, but now everybody else is wrong if they disagree with us. And all around the world, I think people are fed up with this kind of preaching and moral superiority. Now you, as a Slovenian, you live in Europe, you probably have a better sense of this, but it's my impression that most non-Americans see the influence of the United States as one that is constantly declining. Donald Trump doesn't seem to realize that. Donald Trump seems to think that single-handedly, the United States can put tremendous pressure on Iran. We pulled out of this five-nation agreement, and we decided, okay, we don't care if the Germans, the Russians, and everybody else want to stick with this agreement. We're going to go it all by ourselves. And if we decide to punish the Iranians, then we are strong enough and powerful enough to do it on our own. No, it doesn't work that way anymore. China is very soon going to become a larger economy than the United States. So, but I would get your impression as to whether or not the United States, culturally, politically, economically, scientifically, in any of these ways, is the United States prestige increasing or is it decreasing?
There's an interesting data about we spoke about our immigrants and your immigrants and the differences between ethnicities inside Europe and ethnicities inside America. And it's an interesting thing about Slovenia is that in collective sports like basketball, soccer, handball, and so forth, we have many immigrants in the sense that we have many Serbs and Croats and Bosnians that became citizens of Slovenia, or their parents became citizens of Slovenia, and they are top sportsmen in our country in collective sports. But there's an interesting similarity with blacks in America, isn't it? They are also the torch bearers of American supremacism in international sports, aren't they?
Well, it depends on the sport, of course. They certainly are the top basketball player. That's an international sport. They are the top football players. That's not so much an international sport. The Williams sisters in tennis have dominated American tennis for a while, but they are now pretty much out of the picture. So as far as black domination sports, I would say certainly basketball, football, and also track and field to some degree. But West Africans, wherever they're from, are the best sprinters. East Africans, wherever they are from, they are the best long distance runners. But again, that is when I asked you, is the American influence declining or rising in terms of economics or science or culture, politics, any of those things? One thing I did not include was sports. I don't even think in terms of sports, really, as an important factor in some national influence. But I would suggest that probably in sports as well, the American influence is declining. I know, for example, that over the last 10 or 15 years, there have been many non-Americans who come play professional baseball in the United States, many Dominicans, Cubans, even there are Japanese who have come to play Major League Baseball in the United States. So even baseball, which is a sport unlike most of the sports that are played around the world, this is one that was invented in the United States. But our dominance is declining there too. So it is true that American athletes do, in generally in the Olympic Games, they will get perhaps as many or more gold, silver, and bronze medals as any other country. But in terms of real overwhelming dominance, even in sports, I think the United States is declining. And I will be quite candid about this. I think that the decline of the United States, certainly in terms of its cultural or political influence, is a very good thing, because the United States is always against any kind of genuine nationalism, certainly for European countries. It's okay for a non-white country, and it's okay for Israel to be nationalist and to wish to maintain their cultural and ethnic heritage. But all European countries, if you wish to commit suicide, the United States will help you. The United States will encourage you. If, like Hungary or Poland or the Baltic republics, if you wish to maintain your ethnic national heritage, then the United States is your enemy. So I think it is very good that the poisonous ideas that emanate from the United States are losing their influence, and the power of the United States is declining in that respect. And economics is certainly part of it.
How should we think about as sort of say ethno-nationalists? How should we think about economics, about capitalism, about free markets, about global capitalism? Should we differentiate between global capitalism and national capitalism? It seems that ethno-nationalists are being torn apart or between this global capitalistic American conservatism and practically socialistic democratic vision of economics. Where should we take? How should we take part in this?
In this debate, I don't claim to have all the answers, and it's certainly the case that many ethno-nationalists are opposed to what they call global capitalism, because they see it as something that dissolves national boundaries, ethnic boundaries, racial boundaries, tries to make all the world one big market, sell the same products in every market. And so for that reason, global capitalism is our enemy. I'm not entirely convinced of this argument. For example, the Koreans or the Japanese or the Chinese, they are very important participants in global capitalism. They sell their products successfully all around the world. But does that mean that they have themselves let their own nations dissolve in the way that so many white countries have done so? No, they have not. For me, the markets, the free market, capitalism, these are tools, and they are tools that create an enormous amount of wealth. Now, if these tools are in the hands of people like the East Asians, who still have a sense of who they are, a kind of ethnic cultural nationalism, they can make the most of world markets, free markets, product differentiation, segmented markets. They can make free use of all of these things without losing their own personality, their culture, and their heritage. So it's, to me, the problem is not with global capitalism, capitalism per se, or free markets. The problem is with the people who take part in those markets. All throughout the West, we have been persuaded that the kinds of things that I wish to preserve, my biological and cultural heritage as a unique group of Europeans living on the North American continent, this desire is considered illegitimate. But if all Americans, or a sufficiently large number of Americans, shared my view, we could take part in global capitalism, in world markets, just as successfully as the Japanese do, for example, without sacrificing the things that I believe are important. Once we start saying capitalism is no good, free markets are no good, because that means that our ethno-nationalism is being dissolved, then we have to make a choice, okay? If we get rid of capitalism and free markets, what sort of system do we have? What is the record we have for centrally planned economies, for example, for socialism. The record is not good. And so I return once again to the fundamental problem, and that is the racial awareness and national identitarian solidarity of the people of a country, including its ruling class. Once those people have a healthy attitude, then we can use this tool, which is capitalism, this tool, which is free markets, and we can use that to enrich our people successfully without sacrifices of the kind that we see made so frequently.
I read an article I think it was in The Spectator, or was it in National Review? I don't know. And the author of the article wrote that uh, Biden seems not to be as radical as the Democrat Party as a whole. That he will basically just be he will basically just put the old Obama administration back in the seat if he wins. But there could be the problem with his VP Kamala Harris. How do you see Biden Harris hypothetical Biden Harris the presidency, and how much would it differ from the next Trump Pence election?
There's no question that a Biden presidency would be different from a second Donald Trump presidency. As for Joe Biden's own proclivities, I don't think that he's nearly as radical as so many in the Democratic Party. He's not someone who is going to defund the police, for example. He has made many of his radical supporters angry by saying, no, we don't need to take money away from the police. Maybe we have to reform the police, this idea of getting rid of the police forces. He's not as much of a socialist as Bernie Sanders. If you look at Joe Biden from, say, 20 or 30 years ago, he would be practically a Republican today. But he has drifted left along with his party. And now that Black Lives Mania is such an important part of the general Democrat scene, he will adopt certain policies. He has decided that it's okay, at least, to look into the possibility of reparations to Blacks for slavery, for example. Years ago, he would never have talked about white privilege or probably systemic racism or entrenched white supremacy. Now he recognizes that the left requires that he talk in those terms. So he will speak in those terms. But I don't think he feels it. He doesn't have a burning interest in all of this racial foolishness. Kamala Harris, of course, does. Despite the fact that she is more Indian than she is Black, she calls herself a Black. Well, when it suits her, she calls herself an Indian also. These people can be shapeshifters as it suits them. But she would be much more inclined, I think, to redistribute wealth in the United States in a very aggressive way to make Black people richer and white people poor. The question, of course, is how much power would she have in the administration? As you probably know, in the United States, the vice president really has no official role at all, except to preside over the United States Senate. And most of the time, he doesn't do that either. The vice president is someone who is just held in reserve in case the president dies or is incapacitated. And then the vice president takes over. In the meantime, what does the vice president do? That is something that each president decides. And often they will ask the vice president to do various important things. Now, what would Joe Biden do? My suspicion is Joe Biden, he might very well put Kamala Harris in charge of some kind of investigation into the legitimacy of reparations for Black people. He might very well put her in charge of some kind of attempt to raise taxes on the rich. He might do something to reinvigorate something from the Obama administration. And that was something called affirmatively furthering fair housing, AFFH. This was a plan whereby the United States government was going to put an enormous amount of pressure on every neighborhood in the United States to try to integrate it racially. He could put her in charge of things like that. Now, what she manages to do in those positions would depend on how much power he gave her and how much the United States government as a whole and Congress was willing to go along with it. There are, of course, many people who think that a Biden-Harris presidency will essentially be a Harris presidency because Joe Biden is this doddering old goofball who will be manipulated from behind the scenes or manipulated right in front of everybody by Harris and some of these other people. I don't think that's true for a moment. Joe Biden has been in politics for 47 years. He has wanted the top job for at least 20 years. Now, if he gets it, once he has it, he's not going to just sit back and let somebody else make all the decisions. I'm quite convinced that he will exercise power for absolutely as long as he can. He's been clawing at this, wanting to get it for so long. He's not suddenly going to lose all of his ambitions, even though he is an old guy. But who knows? 4 years is a long time. He would be the oldest president ever to be inaugurated. Would he hold up? I don't know. And as he declines, if he does decline in a substantive way, then it is possible that Kamala Harris would have more and more actual authority. On the other hand, you never know. He might have a chief of staff. He might have advisors who would take more authority than Kamala Harris would. All of these things are impossible to say. But I disagree with everyone who says, oh, Joe Biden is just a figurehead. He's going to be manipulated by the people who've got him in there, and the real power is going to be Kamala Harris. That will not be the case for as long as I believe Joe Biden can have any kind of real physical capacity to prevent it from happening.
Well, Slovene dominant media, for example, Slovene national television, are predominantly anti-white, anti-European, anti-Catholic, anti-American. And when I say anti-American, I mean anti-Republican American, at least. They're always against Republican candidates, naturally against Trump even more. But the case with healthcare, if you read Slovene left-wing media, which is basically dominant media, they are predominantly against Trump's handling of the American healthcare. They were naturally for Obama's healthcare, and they naturally think Obama's healthcare was created with the mind for the poor people and for people that have pre-existing conditions, for example. What's your view of healthcare in America, of whether Trump wins or Biden wins?
I don't have really strong views about how medical care should be organized in the United States. I'm generally suspicious of what's called a single-payer system, what used to be called socialized medicine. The United States government does a bad job of running a lot of things. And the idea of the United States government being in charge, completely in charge, all by itself, of medicine, of treatment, all of these decisions, I think would be very, very bad. However, how do you go about solving this problem? One thing that's very common on the left to say is medical care is a human right. Everybody, just because he happens to be here, has got a right to medical care. Well, I mean, really? Unlimited? I mean, even if you have produced nothing in the United States, never paid $1 in taxes, and you have a medical condition that requires millions of dollars of treatment, millions of dollars, that means the rest of us have got to pay for this without limit. If there is, in fact, a single payer, then there have to be limits on just how many resources have to be poured into people just because they're sick. All societies, whether or not they're explicit about this, make decisions of one kind or another. One of the things that Joe Biden has stood up for, and all of the Democrats stood up for, is free medical care for illegal immigrants. Good grief, that becomes an incentive. If you have a kidney problem and you need dialysis, if you have a lousy heart, you need a heart transplant, if you've got type 2 diabetes, if you've got all sorts of difficult medical conditions, that becomes an incentive for you to illegally immigrate into the United States because Joe Biden says you're going to get free medical care. This is absolutely insane. I think most Americans would oppose that. Of course, Donald Trump did a very bad job. He didn't bring this up during the debates. That's one of the first things I would have said. Why? Why on earth? If some illegal immigrant breaks into this country, why are you going to pay? Why do you want me and my neighbors and my family to pay for his medical expenses just because he broke into our country? But he didn't do that. Well, the whole medical thing it's a very, very thorny one, but to me, that is a problem that any society is going to have to work out. And a society that is homogeneous, a society in which all members feel as though they have a stake in society, that's going to be one in which you are going to work out these solutions more equitably, more rationally, and without rancor than in one in which there are so many different constituencies in the United States. We have Hispanics, we have Blacks, we have people who have immigrated, we have people here been here for 13 generations. We have so many disparate ideas of how to run the society that medical care is just one more of the many aspects of governing a society become nearly impossible to get a handle on when you have so many people who have a different view of how the world should work.
Are you aware of the information about Joe Biden's, some people say, obvious pedophilic inclinations, or do you think this is a construct of right-wing media? Yeah.
Well, I think you're talking about there have been many compilations of videos in which he was involved in the swearing in ceremonies for new Democratic congressmen at one point. And they would show up with their families. And he would stand behind some 12-year-old girl or 10-year-old girl. He'd put his hands on her shoulders and he'd sort of put his nose into her hair. And he would do this with people's wives, too. There's a very creepy, weird aspect of this. Whether or not it actually goes to the point of pedophilia, I couldn't tell you. But there is a very strange business about the way he handles himself around women and around young girls in particular. The media now have completely ignored this. I personally think that it is a somewhat repulsive habit, but is this something that really goes to the level of crime or a disqualifying mental disease on the part of a president? I don't know. He's going to be under more scrutiny than ever before in his life. And if he starts putting his nose into ladies' hair, he's going to hear about it. So I don't think that's going to change his ability to govern one way or the other.
You told me before we started the live stream that you didn't watch the town hall with Donald Trump that NBC made. I watched highlights a bit, and then I noticed that an interviewer asked Trump about QAnon. Do you know this hypothesis or this movement? What do you think about this QAnon? I asked this because the interviewer told Trump that they were supposed to be hysterically against supposedly pedophilic party, that is Democratic Party.
I don't know very much about QAnon, but it first came to my attention about 2.5 years ago. Someone showed me a video that was produced by QAnon. And apparently, the people who believe in QAnon think that there is some kind of deep state plot against Donald Trump, but that Donald Trump has got it all figured out. And Donald Trump is sort of constantly communicating the fact that he understands what's going on and he's going to save it all in the end. I think that the evidence for all of this is essentially zero. However, QAnon, uh, the fact that the American Congress voted overwhelmingly to condemn it as some sort of conspiracy theory that's all baloney, I think that's a terrible mistake. The people who believe this, they're going to see that vote and they're going to say, we're right. You see that? They're all manipulated. All those congressmen and senators, they're in the pocket of these shadowy forces that are really controlling things. And all of those legislators are dancing to the tune of all of these secret people. The idea of the United States Congress taking the time to, why not pass some resolution against the Flat Earth Society? This stuff is not Congress's job. And at the same time, when Facebook or Twitter, all of these social media platforms stop circulating any kind of QAnon ideas, that also just feeds their paranoia. It's going to be, look, yes, the forces, the evil forces got to Facebook. The evil forces got to Jack Dorsey at Twitter and Mark Zuckerberg. So everybody's against us. We have to be right. No, I don't claim to know a great deal about it, but the idea of making this, in effect, it's not illegal to talk about it, but suppressing it so vigorously, I think that only makes its believers all the more convinced that they're right.
The cases of Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein, these were obviously Democratic Party, or at least Democratic ideological and cultural milieu darlings before they were exposed as well, child molesters and women molesters. Do you think they could be a good evidence for one of the QAnon hypothesi about the pedophilic background of democratic establishment or milieu, or is this just
Well, of those, it is Jeffrey Epstein, who apparently was interested in young girls. Now, to what extent does he represent the Democratic Party? I think to no great degree whatsoever. I don't think that there's any evidence really that the Democratic Party in any substantial way is a bunch of pedophiles. I just don't see that. No. As far as Harvey Weinstein is concerned, he was a sleazeball who used his power to manipulate women. But as many women, well, not as many, a few courageous women pointed out, if he was in a position to give some actress a job, if she had sex with him, well, that was up to her. As far as I can tell, he never raped any of these women. And so if he said, okay, I'm going to give you this great starring role if you have sex with me, and they said, well, okay, then that was their decision. That the casting couch has been a cliche in Hollywood for a long time. Now, to the extent that he actually did commit crimes, did try to drug women, that kind of thing, I'm perfectly happy to see him go to jail. But there is a kind of delight among ordinary people when rich and famous people come a cropper and end up going to jail. I don't particularly share that glee. If they did something bad, then by all means, send them to jail. But just because someone is rich and powerful, of course, frequently they can buy their way out of it in some way or another. And it's always gratifying when wealth and power are crushed and people who did bad things suffer the consequences. But I do not see that kind of behavior as necessarily typical of the Democrats at all.
This is what I wanted to ask you. A couple of days ago, I had Frodi Midjord on and Dr. E. Michael Jones on, and basically Frodi and Dr. Jones had a bit of debate on the issue of race, and it seems to me that uh, there are at least two different discussions about race. One discussion is about ontology, about what exists, because Dr. Jones says that, for example, that race is a category of mind. This is an ontological um, presupposition, obviously, and Frodi obviously disagrees with this, and you would probably disagree too. What's your opinion on ontology, or your philosophical view of race? What kind of category is it? Is it category of reality, or category of mind, or could it be that it is both?
Oh, by the way, I have a question for you. These questions appear on the screen. Are we expected to deal with these questions, or I suppose I should answer your question rather than a question that appears on the screen?
Oh yeah, sorry, sorry. Uh,
Someone wanted to know if I thought that Joe Biden was given some sort of a combination of drugs to keep him
yeah,
going for the hour and a half during the debate. Um, my answer to that question is I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me either way. I have seen other interviews with him in which he seemed to be doing okay. I know that his enemies all see the slightest trip up, the slightest misuse of any word, and they say, he's losing his mind, he's going senile. Well, if you put together all the videos that I've done, all the interviews that I've given, and you snipped out all the places when I said something stupid or confused, you could make me look like I'm losing my mind and going senile, and I'm going to be locked up in a mental institution anytime soon. So I've never believed the idea that somehow he's about to just fall apart and get locked up in an Alzheimer's ward. So I don't know for sure whether or not he got any drugs. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But I just don't think he's going senile at nearly the rate at which his enemies think he is.
if you were said, I doubt JT ever said something stupid.
I said many stupid things. Uh,
So,
but anyway, you asked the question you asked about race.
mhm.
Well, to me, what could be more obvious than the fact that race is a biological phenomenon? If you look at a pygmy, and you look at an Eskimo, and you look at a Dane, anyone, even people who are not old enough to speak, know that these are different groups, that they are different. The idea that this is a social construct. Now, a social construct is something that people have applied to something that doesn't necessarily exist in reality. Now, they've done tests with toddlers, people just a few months old, and you set them in their mother's laps, and you can show them photographs of faces of different races. And you can tell by the way they track that they find some faces more familiar than other faces. They find some faces more threatening than other faces. They are reacting to something that is a biological difference. There's no social construct they're reacting to. They're too young to have any social construct at all. And furthermore, people who are 2 or 3 years old, but then they can talk, of course. They've never heard of someone saying, this idea that black people are somehow different from white people or Asians, it's all baloney. It's all no, they've never heard of that. They make those distinctions instinctively, instantly, and in a way that shows that they are seeing something that's real. It's not something they've been hypnotized into thinking. So the idea that somehow this is not biology, as I say, this is something that's so wrong and so stupid that only very intelligent people can possibly persuade themselves that it's true. Furthermore, with only a few little samples of DNA, you can tell unerringly what someone's biological racial origin is. Is it somehow the idea that the DNA has been fooled by the social construct too? And there's another racial difference that I find amusing, and that is, did you know that depending on your race, you can figure out someone's race almost unerringly, simply by examining the pattern and the particular types of bacteria that live in that person's mouth. And this is true even if you're talking about people in the same race living in the same country. So if you took an African immigrant and you took an Asian immigrant living here in the United States, and you sampled the you sampled the bacteria in their mouth, just by looking at those bacteria samples, you could say, yeah, this guy's the African, this guy's the Asian. They could have been living here for 10 years, swallowing the same kind of food. But there is something about the environment of the mouth that makes it friendlier to one set of bacteria rather than others. So the idea, excuse me, the idea that race is some kind of an optical illusion that we force upon each other, where did this cuckoo idea even come from? And I'm surprised that someone like E. Michael Jones, who's a pretty intelligent guy, who's done a lot of reading, I don't see how on earth he can subscribe to what is such a lefty fantasy when he considers himself something of a reactionary and a conservative.
He says this is an identity theft, and I do sympathize with this as a funny strategy against lefties. For example, I hypothesized this in our live stream a couple of days ago. If an administrator, an interviewer would say to Trump, you should just denounce Proud Boys, you should just denounce white supremacists, and Trump could say, but why would I do that? And the administrator would say, because you're president, because you're white yourself. And Donald Trump could say, but I'm not white. I'm German. I'm half German and half, and I'm Presbyterian, for example. I do sympathize with this rhetorical strategy. For example, this could be efficient. We have to admit, but ontologically, philosophically, I don't see how one could deny the existence of different races.
Well, the way I see it is that when people say that we are all biologically the same, it's a way of softening white people up to accept their own replacement. Because we're being told, no, you're not being replaced. You're being replaced by yourself. These people can be from Kenya or Haiti or Guatemala or from Vietnam, but they are biologically no different from you. So white people, bye-bye. It won't make any difference because they are biologically exactly the same thing as you. Now, having said that race is some kind of sociological optical illusion, the left is awfully good at figuring out who's black and who's white and who's Asian and all that other stuff, especially when it comes to racial preferences. Or when Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis police officer, put his knee on the neck of George Floyd, then nobody had any trouble at all saying, ooh, that was a white man. Ooh, that poor guy on the ground was a black man. If this is a social construct, if it's not biological, how could we tell? Just looking at the video, how did we know? And if I were the dean of students at a university and a black student came to me and said, well, we want dormitories just for black people. And if I said, wait, black people? But, race doesn't exist. It's just all a social construct. How can I have a dormitory just for a social construct? They would probably burn the campus down. So there is complete schizophrenia on this thing. On the one hand, they tell us this isn't biology. This is something that's been cooked up by the mind of man. It does not exist independently of our own prejudiced ideas. And yet, we can tell at a glance. We don't have to think about it at all. Instantly, we know this guy's black, this guy's Asian. So to me, this is one of the great mysteries of how this kind of utter foolishness can have reached the popularity that it has. And now I find, though, the idea of race as a social construct, as something that is imaginary, we don't hear about that nearly as much as we used to. I think that to some extent, the DNA, and to some extent, the biology, to some extent, the fact that medical treatments differ for people of different races, and the fact that they're now trying to develop vaccines for COVID, for example, And they're saying, well, wait a minute, you have to have blacks and Hispanics and Asians in the test group. Huh? Why? Why do we have to have them in the test group? It's not biology. There's nothing biological about it at all. It's social contract. Since it's a social construct, and we're all the same human race, all 99.9% genetically identical. Why do you need blacks in the vaccine test group? No, there's just too much obviously contradictory here for the left to hold on to this. And so we don't hear nearly as much as we used to this social construct balloon.
Yep. Rafael Ramirez commented, Michael Jones is a Thomist and an Aristotelian. He doesn't mean construct by category. He means substance or as abstract or substance as primary. Jones's point is very subtle but crucial. Yeah, I do understand this comment, but yeah, of course he means that ethnicity is substance or primary, and race is secondary, or that because it is secondary, it doesn't even exist in the real sense if you take into consideration that only substances exist. For example, but this is for everyday language, for common sense language, for language that the folk speak. This is probably too subtle of a language, and maybe this is too of a too academical of language that Dr. Jones uses, if he uses it in this sense.
Well, it may be too subtle for me to understand. I'm not quite sure the distinction that's being drawn here. A substance as abstract or substance as primary. I would have to have some better explanation as to the distinction that's being drawn. Certainly, there is a difference between race and ethnicity, for example. Ethnicity is something that is not necessarily biological. And you can have people who are biologically very similar, people who have spent many generations in North America, whose ancestors were all British. And you can compare them with people who have remained in Britain. And there are differences in these groups, even though biologically and racially they're the same. But I don't believe that kind of distinction between people who are biologically similar negates the whole idea of the reality of race. Just as if we have North Korea, we have South Korea. Those people are genetically very, very, very similar, but they have been reared under circumstances that have made them almost two different nationalities or two different ethnicities. But again, this does not, in my mind, undercut the biological reality of race.
Yeah. Okay, let's see if anybody from the audience has another question. Maybe this topic of ontology, of the existence of race and ethnicity as a primary or as an abstract or as a construct could be a part of your debate with Dr. Jones, if it ever happens in Zagreb next year, if this COVID thing goes away. Mr. Taylor, thank you once again. It was a great honor. I hope we can see each other again on a stream about another topic. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's been my great pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, and I wish you every success in your work. And long live Slovenia for the Slovenians.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and long live America, whatever that means nowadays.
That's just it. No one knows what it means.
No one knows what it means.
Yes.
Good afternoon to America, and
Thank
good
you.
evening for us. Goodbye.
Bye.